You're walking down a crowded European street in the 1980s. To everyone else, this is just an ordinary afternoon. But for one man in the crowd, it's the last day of his old life. In his pocket is a microdot. In his head are the secrets of a superpower. And behind him is an entire security apparatus that has executed people for far less. He's about to defect from the KGB. KGB defectors are often portrayed as brilliant chess masters or glamorous double agents. The reality was messier, darker, and far more dangerous. They were gamblers whose stakes were their families, their identities, and sometimes their sanity. Tonight, we're going inside their world, the tradecraft they used, the fatal mistakes they made, and the myths that still cloud our understanding of them. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you might never watch a spy movie the same way again. In this video, we're going to break down the story of KGB defectors in 3 dimensions: what they actually did, how they got caught or escaped, and what the legends get wrong. We'll look at real tradecraft, brush passes, dead drops, coded signals, and compare it to the sloppy improvisations that doomed some operatives. We'll examine famous cases like Oleg Gordievsky, who betrayed the KGB from inside London, and lesser-known figures whose stories were buried in classified files. We'll also talk about the human side, the fear, paranoia, and the brutal choices defectors faced when deciding whether to abandon their country or their families. If you're into content that cuts through the Hollywood gloss and focuses on the documented reality of espionage, consider subscribing, hitting the notification bell, and sticking with this episode to the very end. The final segment will tie together how these Cold War lessons still shape modern Russian intelligence today. To understand KGB defectors, you need to understand what the KGB was. Formed in 1954, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti was more than just a spy agency. It was a state within a state. It ran foreign intelligence, domestic surveillance, border security, even guarded Soviet leaders. Its officers were part spy, part political enforcer, and their loyalty was supposed to be absolute. Inside this system, defection was not just betrayal, it was ideological treason. The KGB trained its people to view the West as a hostile, decaying enemy, yet those same officers were often the ones posted abroad, exposed to Western media, consumer culture, and a very different version of reality. That tension between indoctrination and observation created cracks. Defection usually wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was a slow accumulation of disillusionment, personal grievances, fear of purges, or simple self-preservation. When KGB officers broke, they broke against a machine that was designed to destroy them in return. Not all KGB defectors were alike. Intelligence services usually grouped them into 3 broad categories. First, walk-ins, people who literally walked into a Western embassy and volunteered. They often arrived unannounced, sometimes panicked, sometimes drunk, occasionally carrying documents to prove who they were. Many were dismissed as provocateurs or mentally unstable. Second, recruited agents, KGB officers or sources who were quietly turned by Western intelligence and then run as spies in place. These were the most valuable. They could feed information for years before exfiltration. Third, post-defection whistleblowers, those who escaped for personal reasons, fear of arrest, political disagreement, and only later became systematic sources of intelligence. Each type posed different problems. Walk-ins were security nightmares. Recruited insiders required careful tradecraft to stay alive. Whistleblowers might exaggerate or distort, consciously or not. Understanding which type you're dealing with is key to weighing any defector's story and to seeing where myth seeps into the historical record. Let's look at some emblematic defectors. Oleg Penkovsky, a GRU officer often linked with KGB history, provided critical intelligence during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His photos of Soviet missile sites helped the US gauge Moscow's real capabilities. But his meetings in Moscow were so frequent and risky that many officers later saw his tradecraft as reckless. Anatoliy Golitsyn defected to the CIA in 1961. He brought valuable information on Soviet operations, but also made sweeping, often conspiratorial claims about long-term communist deception. Those claims fueled internal paranoia and bitter splits inside Western services. Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel in London, became one of MI6's crown jewels. For years, he briefed British intelligence on Soviet strategy, even while hosting official delegations. His eventual exfiltration from Moscow in the trunk of a car reads like fiction, but was meticulously planned. Each of these men shaped Western views of the KGB, but their stories also show how uneven, human, and imperfect defection really was. Popular culture makes tradecraft look glamorous and effortless. The reality for KGB defectors and their handlers was a grind of small, careful techniques designed to avoid patterns. They used dead drops, hiding messages under park benches, in wall cracks, or inside hollowed-out bricks. Signals might be a chalk mark on a lamppost, a moved flower pot on a windowsill, or a specific page of a newspaper folded outward in a cafe. Surveillance detection routes were crucial. Deliberately complicated walks through cities, entering shops, doubling back, riding multiple transport lines, all to flush out tails. Communication could involve one-time pads, shortwave radio, or prearranged phrases in seemingly harmless letters. For defectors in place like Gordievsky, the hardest part was living a double life, attending KGB briefings by day, secretly reporting them by night. Tradecraft was less about gadgets and more about discipline, never rushing, never showing off, never believing you're smarter than the opposition. If tradecraft is about discipline, many KGB defectors and their Western handlers failed at exactly that. Some mistakes were technical, others were purely human. Patterned meetings were a classic error, using the same route to a safe house, the same cafe at the same time, or predictable signaling methods. The KGB and Western counterintelligence both learned to watch for routine. Careless documentation was another. Penkovsky's photography sessions became too frequent, drawing suspicion. In other cases, defectors kept incriminating notes or personal diaries. But the biggest vulnerability was ego. Some defectors exaggerated their importance, demanded money or political recognition, or started freelancing beyond agreed protocols. This led Western services to over-rely on a single source, or to miss signs that the person might be a plant or becoming unstable. Once a defector's behavior created noise, sudden wealth, erratic mood swings, unexplained absences, security services on both sides started asking hard questions, often too late. What happened when a KGB officer actually crossed the line and made contact with the West? The first step wasn't celebration, it was suspicion. Western intelligence services treated walk-ins as potential provocation operations. Was this person genuine, or a carefully prepared penetration agent? Debriefings could last days, then months, then years. Analysts cross-checked every claim against existing files, intercepted communications, and other sources. Psychological assessment was central. Was the defector coherent, consistent, and emotionally stable? Did their motivations, ideology, fear, greed align with their story? In many cases, agencies quietly sidelined defectors whose information seemed self-serving or unverifiable. Even after acceptance, life wasn't glamorous. Many lived under assumed identities in small towns, endlessly retelling the same experiences to new interrogators. Others were used in propaganda campaigns or court cases, which further endangered any family left behind. For most, defection was less a heroic escape and more a permanent, exhausting interview. One of the most brutal aspects of KGB defection was the impact on family. The KGB understood that loyalty wasn't only ideological, it was personal. Spouses, children, parents, these were leverage. Some defectors escaped with their families, but many did not. Penkovsky's relatives suffered after his arrest. Other officers saw their loved ones demoted, harassed, or simply disappear into the labyrinth of Soviet punishment. Western handlers faced excruciating choices. prioritize the flow of intelligence or the safety of non-combatants who never volunteered for this life. Exfiltrating a whole family dramatically increased the risk of exposure. Leaving them behind meant living with the knowledge that every press conference, every leak, might trigger retaliation. This reality undercuts one of the biggest myths, that defectors simply change sides and start a new life. In truth, many carried the guilt and fear for decades. Even in witness protection, they checked over their shoulders, knowing Moscow sometimes settled scores years later. Another myth is that defectors instantly become trusted advisors. In reality, they often triggered vicious turf wars inside Western agencies. Golitsyn is a prime example. Some CIA and MI5 officers believed almost everything he said about deep Soviet penetration of Western institutions. Others thought he was exaggerating, paranoid, or even delusional. The result was years of internal investigations, career destruction, and mutual suspicion. Defectors could also be used as weapons in bureaucratic battles. If your department championed a particular source, their success or failure became tied to your own. This created incentives to overstate their value or to bury contradictory evidence. On the other side, the KGB used the existence of defectors to justify broader internal purges, feeding a culture of fear. Ironically, one defector's story could paralyze not just one intelligence service, but multiple, as everyone tried to guess who was lying, who was mistaken, and who was simply human. Assassination is one of the darkest threads running through the story of KGB defectors. While not every defector was targeted, enough were that the threat was real. During the Cold War, suspected Soviet involvement in poisonings, suspicious car crashes, and suicides loomed over exiles. Later, high-profile cases like Alexander Litvinenko's polonium poisoning and the Skripal nerve agent attack in Salisbury showed that the post-Soviet Russian state inherited both the mindset and some methods. For defectors, this meant that defection was not a one-time risk but a lifelong sentence. The more public they became, writing books, giving interviews, the more they had to weigh visibility as protection versus provocation. Western governments, meanwhile, had to decide how visibly to shield them. Tough protection sends a message, but also advertises the fact that this person is worth killing. In that sense, every defector's continued survival is a quiet, ongoing negotiation between states, fought in shadows. Let's tackle a few persistent myths about KGB defectors. Myth 1. They were all ideological heroes. In truth, motives were mixed. Some opposed communism on principle, but others were driven by fear of being purged, career dead ends, money problems, or personal grudges. Myth 2. Defection reliably reveals the truth about an adversary. Defectors see only a slice of the system, often distorted by their rank, department, or personal bias. Their testimony is invaluable but never complete. Myth 3. Sophisticated gadgets dominated their work. While there were clever devices, most operations depended on mundane habits, timing, routes, paper, faces remembered and forgotten. Myth 4. Once you defect, you're free. In reality, many traded one form of control for another, from the KGB's surveillance state to Western security protocols, NDAs, and debriefing rooms. Separating these myths from documented reality helps us judge both the defectors' stories and the way governments weaponize them. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, the logic of defection hasn't disappeared, it's evolved. Russian intelligence services, FSB, SVR, GRU, are direct institutional descendants of the KGB. Their officers face many of the same pressures: political purges, internal rivalries, exposure to the West, and moral disillusionment. Recent defectors and high-profile whistleblowers show familiar patterns: carefully staged approaches to Western services, complex debriefings, and immediate questions about credibility and motive. At the same time, technology has changed the game. Digital trails, biometrics, and global surveillance make traditional tradecraft both harder and, paradoxically, more necessary. Dead drops might now be encrypted servers, brush passes can be cloud file transfers, but the core problems of trust, fear, and betrayal are identical. Understanding KGB-era defectors isn't nostalgia, it's a toolkit. The methods, mistakes, and myths we've discussed still shape how modern states recruit, protect, and sometimes hunt those who switch sides. Let's pull together the main threads. First, KGB defectors were not superhuman chess masters. They were flawed individuals operating under crushing pressure. Their tradecraft, when it worked, relied on discipline and routine, not gadgets and heroism. Second, defection was never clean. Western intelligence services doubted, dissected, and sometimes exploited these people. Inside their former homeland, families paid the price, and the threat of revenge often lingered for life. Third, mistakes, ego, patterns, overconfidence killed operations as often as any brilliant counterintelligence move. The line between a legendary source and a doomed asset was usually one or two bad decisions. Finally, the myths around defectors shape how we interpret modern whistleblowers and intelligence leaks. By romanticizing or demonizing them, we miss the complex reality that they're windows into secret systems, but also unreliable narrators of their own stories. If you remember anything, remember this: espionage is always human first, technical second. If you've stayed with this video to the end, you now know that the story of KGB defectors is far more complex than the average spy thriller. We've walked through their tradecraft, their fatal mistakes, and the myths that still color how we think about them and about modern intelligence. If you want more long-form dives into the hidden history of espionage, power, and covert operations, this is exactly the kind of content we publish regularly. So if you haven't already, take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. In the comments, tell me which part surprised you most: the handling of walk-ins, the family consequences, or the way myths warped entire agencies. And if there's a specific spy operation or agency you'd like us to cover next, drop your suggestions below. Thanks for watching, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into the world behind the headlines.